Hello, thank you for this opportunity, Armagora, to do this Ask Me Anything. Special thanks to the Future Armenian for launching the Armagora platform, a very exciting way for an informed, inspired discourse on all the issues, all the challenges and opportunities facing us as Armenians in the homeland and across our global diaspora. Thank you very much for the 18 questions that were submitted. I'd very much like to address each and every one of them, and I'll just jump right in. So first question is, who is the future Armenian? I jotted down some notes. So who is the future Armenian? Here are some thoughts. Aram Hamparian's take on the future Armenian. Citizens of a global nation, and a better integration of homeland and diaspora. I look at my own kids. My wife was born in Sunik, outside of the city of Kapan. Our kids have spent, maybe about 10% of their lives in Armenia. I like to think they're as comfortable there as they are here. I think that ultimately is the future. There obviously will always be things that are a bit more homeland, a bit more diasporan, in people's hearts and souls, but ultimately an integration of those two parts of our reality. A nation in which we're, continue to be high achievers, and increasingly our success, individual success, contributes to our collective progress. So I think that's a really, really important thing. We have a lot of achievers. A lot of those achievers, that achievement is sort of like harvested for the benefit of the nation. Some of it isn't. Seeing an increasing alignment of personal success and collective success. A couple other thoughts. More consumers, but more producers of Armenian identity. The Armenian experience is a good experience. We have a tightly knit social fabric. We have wonderful institutions, excellent food, good music, a lot of fellowship, and people enjoy that. They enjoy the experience, and they should. And we want more people to consume the Armenian experience, but also more people to be the producers of that identity, whether it's artistic or political or economic, whatever it is. So looking for both on the consumption side and the production side, both to increase. Another thought, more citizen, less subject. I mean, we spent, for every year that Armenians have spent as citizens of free state or independent nation, we spent many more under other empires and have developed some of the habits of subjects. And, we're seeing an increasingly move toward the identity of citizens. Less an object of history, more the subject, defining our own destiny, more political. Now, this is a term that I think has been unfairly denigrated in our Armenian experience, certainly over the last century or so. But being political simply means a willingness to work with other people, to work in concert with others, to make compromises with others toward shared aims, which is actually a noble thing. We have developed over the years, over the centuries, a distrust of authority, a distrust of government, a distrust of institutions, when collective action is very likely our salvation. I think Chadan spoke to that very eloquently. There is, in defining the future Armenian, always tension between kind of a big tent and kind of a narrower conception of, what makes an Armenian or a good Armenian. I wrote an article many years ago called "We're All Armenian," and it made a big tent case that pretty much whatever, if you have a drop of Armenian blood, you're adopted into an Armenian family, you married into an Armenian family, any particular configuration, right? You didn't grow up Armenian, you don't speak Armenian, you don't go to Armenian church, all that stuff. Very big tent that there's a place for all of us in the Armenian world, and we should love and respect each of our brothers and sisters, meet them where they are, and work with them toward whatever it is that we have in common. And I wrote that article, and it got a pretty decent reception in the diaspora. And about a year later, I took a trip to Armenia, where I met one of my friends, my Ungers from Syria, who had at the time, was actually physically, militarily defending the Armenian communities when they were under attack, our community in Holland. And he pulled me aside. He said, Unger, I read your article, and I see why you wrote that article. You're the head of the ANCA, and you kind of have you're looking to enlist as many Armenians as possible in, let's say, the saving of Armenia. And he was like, I get that. But there's a difference between somebody who runs from a fight and somebody who runs to the fight. There's some difference between somebody who runs from a fire that's, let's say, threatening children, and another who might run into the fire to save those children. there's a difference. And I understood that. I think if I could like just put a tag on that, it would be like a Nezhda view of being Armenian, which is you kind of have to earn that identity. And there's some truth to that, important truth to that. There's also very important truth on the side of Big Tent conception of being Armenian. I think that we have to hold a special place in our hearts for those who give the most and sacrifice the most, respect the heroes among us, while meeting every Armenian exactly where they are. And if they have even just a shadow of an interest in contributing collectively or even being part of the Armenian world, we welcome them in and accept them as brothers, but always hold that special place for those who serve and sacrifice. I'll touch on this later. There's a lot that changes in the Armenian world. A lot's changing in the Armenian world, and it's normal. It's good. We have to adapt to it, and deal with the future as it unfolds. But one thing I think that will not change is that service and sacrifice will remain a constant of the Armenian nation. It's not always convenient. It's not the popular thing to say, but somebody somewhere is going to serve. Somebody somewhere is going to sacrifice for the Armenian nation to maintain its place at the table of nations. That's question number one. What are the ANCA's, number two, what are the ANCA's main responsibilities during this pre-election period? What are your expectations from the U.S. presidential candidates? Okay, I'm going to take half a step back and talk about how we look at these elections. Okay, one way, this is going to be a little theoretical. One way we think about engaging with American policymakers, right? The one plane would be the geopolitical plane, right? And that involves, debate and discussion and discourse, sharing of information, exchanging ideas, exploring, potential pathways forward with decision makers in our case, the U.S. foreign policy establishment, diplomacy, defense, intelligence, National Security Council, that world. And we have to have that discussion, and it needs to take place at the level of diplomats and diasporans and other stakeholders, coalition supporters, congressional friends. That geopolitical discourse has to take place. I think we have to enter that process with our eyes open, understanding that change will be incremental. It will likely not be at the pace that we want or expect, but nonetheless, that engagement needs to take place. Typically, you're dealing with, if someone's in anything close to decision-making capacity, they're a senior figure in that world, and they might be 50 or 60 years old. And the chance that we are, through the force of our intellect or the passion of our moral argument, going to shift their thinking in any meaningful way is probably low in any given discussion. But nonetheless, that discussion needs to take place, and we're perfectly happy to do that, along with many others. That's number one. Number two, another plane is a civilizational plane or a cultural plane, like democracy or religion. Armenia's westward orientation, its European aspirations, the fact that Armenians are early Christians, like many Americans. We're just like you. That kind of engagement, is very powerful, but over a long term, right? If we expect that the sympathy or affinity that Americans, even decision makers, feel with Armenia will shape policy, it's like not going to shape policy in any given case. And if it's going to make an impact, and it'll be over the course of years and even decades. So that's a second plane. The third plane we operate on, and I think it's the most fruitful one, is the level of constituency. The fact that we are stakeholders in our American democracy. We're voters, we're volunteers, we're donors, we're political actors, in a whole range of different ways. Fully invested stakeholders in the American democratic enterprise. That is where we, I think, can make the greatest impact and where we have the most control. Can't control what takes place inside the main think tanks necessarily, or deep inside the policy planning bureau of the State Department, but we can influence the American political process through the fact that we are citizens of this republic. And I think that's how we view this election. And when I say I'm not particularly focused on who will be the better candidate, certainly we're not focused on who's making the better promises, because I think we understand the nature of promises in American campaign culture. What we do want is to leave this election cycle with the perception among policy and political leaders that the Armenians are an electoral constituency that matters in key states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, elsewhere. right? That we can make a difference in these states that matter to who will be elected president, and that our votes need to be earned. I think there's an American phrase some of you may be familiar with, such that we want to act such that we are not viewed as a cheap date. That Armenians who may line up, across, let's say there's a bell curve of Armenians across the American political spectrum, which is perfectly normal. We're happy, we're proud, we're pleased that Armenians are so well represented across, American politics. But that on Armenian issues, Armenians will cross party lines, and that if you cross the Armenians, that comes with consequences. That must be the case. That must be the case. There will be Armenians, and some of them are my dear friends, some of them are our relatives, who will not ever vote for a Republican or ever vote for a Democrat. But there's a lot more toward the middle, will vote not only based on Armenia, but they will seriously consider Armenian issues when deciding who to support in the presidential election, certainly in congressional elections. So I think that's how we view the elections. And if we're successful in doing that, and I think we are gaining traction in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, if we do that, we'll be in a position to be political players, right? Constituency players, not just geopolitical, argument makers, not just people engaging in moral suasion, but rather as actual stakeholders who affect outcomes, who can impose costs and consequences on those who, for example, armed Azerbaijan to kill thousands of young Armenian men. So let us move on to 3. How might the results of the upcoming U.S. election affect U.S.-Armenian relations? I'm going to kind of go back to my previous answer, which is the primary takeaway is not, whether it's Trump or Harris. The primary takeaway is that we have to emerge as a stronger constituency. And if we do, whoever gets in office and their party will think, let me not cross the Armenians because that will come with a cost. That's the outcome that we want. It's not this notion that the left or the right will save us. First, it's a fiction, and second, it absolves us of responsibility. This is asi mer tabne. This is asi mer bardagamnatune. This is not. We're not outsourcing our hopes and dreams and expectations of America to any given politician. They over the years have shown us that they do not deserve that, and it's just simply not the smart thing to do. Number 4, what defines the Armenian American today? What is the ANC strategy in continuing to build a robust community? This is a really, really interesting question, and there's been a lot of scholarship on the question of what is a diaspora, what is an Armenian American. I've read the literature, I find it fascinating. At the same time, as scholars are trying to figure this out, people are doing it, people are living it, and they have done so now in the U.S. for 5 or 6 generations. I would say that the keys to Armenian Americans today, at least as far as advocacy is concerned, fall into 3 baskets, or 3 necessary conditions, more precisely. 3 necessary conditions. The first is Armenians in America who care, right? Who in their heart feel some passion or longing or devotion to being Armenian and preserving our place among the family of nations. That is something I wish the ANC could take credit for, but it's not. That doesn't start with groups like us. That starts in the home with the parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles. Very often the church is involved, a pastor, a Sunday school. I teach Sunday school here at Surplach. It's one of my favorite and also most humbling experiences of the week. There's supposed to be friends, relatives, organizations that cultivate that spirit. And then typically as teenagers, we start interacting with them, and then we face 2 more challenges. So the first is, do they care? That's up to others, and our community actually does a spectacular job of producing devoted Armenians. The second is, do they know what they might do politically, right, in terms of advocacy? And the answer is probably not, but they can learn very quickly. The nuts and bolts of advocacy in the United States are actually very simple. It involves being involved in campaigns and some campaign finance and some volunteering and some lobbying, legislative research, coalition building, some media work, social media work now. The stuff of advocacy is actually not complex and can be taught usually in the course of a few hours, maybe a few days. That's a second precondition, right? Can they understand or will they understand? The answer is yes. The third is, and this is one that where a point of failure all too often, which is, does that Armenian in America believe that their involvement will make a difference? Do they have faith that some collective enterprise will produce the results that they want? And there's a lot in Armenian history, and it kind of beaten into our DNA over thousands of years that says no, that actually the collective action will be fruitless. Better to keep your head down, learn a trade, trust a close circle, and don't get involved with these collective enterprises because they'll lead to nothing. I think that is a dangerous thing. I think that we've seen over the past 2 centuries a counter to that. You saw it in the writings of Mikhail Nalbanyan, in the writings of Khachar Rabovian, later on by Rafi, the revolutionary movement, the Zartunk, this awakening of Armenians, that you think that you can avoid the realities of the world, but you can't. There's a storm coming. We need to organize. We need, frankly, to count on ourselves and not hope that keeping our head down will save our heads. So that, I think, the shift that we need to see, and we are seeing, is one toward more of ownership of being Armenian, like being the landlord of the Armenian house, not a tenant in somebody else's house. And part of that, I think, an important point, and this speaks to the work that we do as ANC, is being very careful never to outsource our cause. And I say that like in the context of this election. The idea that we would place our hopes in a Donald Trump or a Kamala Harris to advance our cause is, again, not smart, not moral, unrealistic, and absolves us of the responsibility that we need to take upon our own shoulders. Okay, number 5, Washington has been lenient on the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. Why has there not been sufficient action? And it's a longer question, but I'll let you read it there. The answer is that's extremely true. Azerbaijan has been given a free pass. Some memo went down, maybe in 2017, 2018, I'm not exactly sure when, but somebody at NSC, sent a cable to somewhere, all the other kind of like key posts of U.S. diplomacy and defense, and the message was something like, Azerbaijan gets a free pass, blank check for them. They knew very well what Azerbaijan was going to do. They knew very likely exactly when and how they were going to do it. And I say this bearing great responsibility for the fact that we cannot prevent this, that nobody in this town, nobody in DC of any import, of any consequence, lost a moment's sleep over the loss of Artsakh. There have been moments in, let's say, the last couple of decades where U.S. policy rose to the level of sort of presidential attention. The three, I think, that I can point to directly dealt with the genocide issue. We have yet to really figure out exactly how much presidential attention Artsakh got under Trump and Biden, but certainly when Obama first came in 2009, he did address whether or not he would honor his genocide pledge. He, of course, chose not to. He readdressed it at the centennial in 2015, and then Biden did, to his credit, recognize the Armenian genocide in 2021. That had to come to his desk. Whether or not the Artsakh issue rose to that level, it's not clear. My instinct is that this was just delegated down the chain of command to the level of like the deputy assistant secretary of something or other, and they just were on autopilot. Don't upset Turkey, Azerbaijan's, the party that we're courting here. If we can create problems for Russia or Iran using the Armenian issue, then get to it. It was treated at the level of as a derivative of other policies. So, yeah, I think that the Armenian issue, exactly that. Let me repeat that. The Armenian issue is viewed as derivative of other policies. Might it create problems for Russia? How can it help Ukraine? How might it contain Iran? How might it, affect Israel's security? That's, I think, the level at which it's being addressed, and it's a very that level is never going to be good for us. It's typically behind closed doors, right? So in Congress, for example, you might have over the last 4 years more than 200 members of Congress have in some fashion criticized Azerbaijan's aggression and stood in defense of Artsakh and Armenia. Maybe in that same time, 1 or 2 members have, maybe celebrated Azerbaijan's independence day. It's a very, very low number. So there's a huge disparity at the congressional level, but yet behind closed doors, whether it's state or defense or intelligence, they put the brakes on anything that might hold Azerbaijan accountable. And this speaks to a very, very important point, which is that decisions taken out in the open, right, out in the open, are generally favorable to us. Decisions taken in the shadows are usually adverse to our interest or inimical to our aspirations. I'll give an example. Last year, Senator Peters offered a bill, S3000, to enforce the statutory restriction on assistance to Azerbaijan. It came to the Senate floor for a vote. Not a single member of the Senate opposed it. It passed by unanimous consent. We could say the same about the genocide resolution in 2019. When it finally got to the floor after decades of obstruction, it passed unanimously in the Senate and very nearly unanimously in the House. This speaks to the point that the bright spotlight of public scrutiny works to our benefit. The dark shadows are usually where we take hits. I will say this, that there is an approach that the only voice that we should have in Washington is a political voice, an incremental voice, one that says, we're not super happy about this, and this is, we generally support this, but we wanted to move 3 degrees in this direction, and just play at the margins and not upset anybody. And I understand that's a way that people think. Extremely common in DC. You go along to get along. It is the staple of countless fortunes that have been made across the city. There are tens of thousands of people who play that game every single day. That's called a political voice. How to get something from the process politically, not by disrupting the process, but by accepting the terms of the game and playing the game to some advantage. That's A. B is a more prophetic voice, which is to say, calling out lies, for example, right? And I speak now the prophetic voice in like a biblical voice, where some prophet from the Old Testament might call out Pharaoh for his injustices. That voice is also needed in our world. And I'll be very plain about it. Our government, my government, I'm sitting right here in front of the flag that my dad brought back from the Second World War. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and the Korean War. And the idea that we owe it to anybody in this country to be lied to is, I never made that deal. I'm a citizen. I've read my Constitution. There's no obligation on the part of Armenians or any American to be lied to and to take that sitting down. And we are lied to all too often. They lied about the genocide for the better part of actually more than a century. And they lied about Artsakh nonstop. If you read declassified CIA reports, they understood very well that Artsakh was Armenian land, but they lied publicly about it. They called it a conflict when it was ultimately a crime. It was the theft of land, and enforcement of Stalin's borders. We were lied to nonstop for decades, and I think that we're entitled to call that out in a way that pulls no punches. We have no fear, no favor. We should speak the truth, and I think that both the political voice and the prophetic voice are important for our community. We should not, depend on one or the other, but strive for a healthy balance. Okay, where are we now? What does ANC do to support the illegally imprisoned Armenians in Baku? Very high priority for us. We are working on sanction cases, and we have a number of partners in the legal world, a number of partners, approaching half a dozen now, who are working very diligently to submit the necessary cases to the Departments of Treasury and State. That's one level. The second is legislative level. So, for example, HR 8141, offered by Congressman Titus, speaks to the need for sanctions on Azerbaijan for their many things, including their treatment of prisoners. We're doing direct advocacy with the Department of State. So we're active on at least 3 fronts: legislative, legal, and direct diplomacy on this issue. I will say, and this speaks to a broader point, which may be the topic for another discussion, which is that Yerevan's approach to issues, certainly post-2020, has set a soft ceiling of sorts on how seriously Armenian issues get taken in Washington. So the question of the right of return to Artsakh, right? A right that the United States, Armenia, and Azerbaijan have committed to through a number of international instruments, right? That's not, you're not going to hear a lot about that, in fact, anything about that from Yerevan, but you will hear about it from us. But that difference, right, that delta, is then taken advantage of by the political and policy characters in Washington who are wolves. These are not, for all their diplomatic niceties, they're more reptile than human when it comes to geopolitics, right? So if they see that gap, right, they will then play that card and say, well, you know, you're rattling the cage about the prisoners. We don't seem to hear quite a lot about that during our discussions with officials from Yerevan. And that is a handicap. And what we take from that is that we just have to work that much harder to get the prisoners out. Number seven. What concrete progress have we seen in recent years? Do you feel the current level of U.S. political engagement is truly benefiting Armenia, or is it more symbolic? Fair question. It's a tough question, but it's a fair question. Let me say this. There is always going to be a debate in our world, especially because Armenia is a smaller country, not central to the geopolitics of the world or even the region, right? There's always going to be like this tension between hard power and soft power. And our hunger will always be for hard power. And I think one of the phrases you may have heard growing up was "Miain Zenkovga Hayot Purgatum." The only salvation of the Armenian nation will be through arms. Now, there is a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. There's also truth in the fact that soft power matters, right? Actions that are less than the physical defense or physical offense by the forces of the Armenian military, right? That's supremely important and maybe decisively so. But that doesn't mean that there isn't place for soft power. There isn't a place to put your opponents on a back foot, to lift your equities, right, to a higher and more powerful position. I would cite, for example, we've wrestled with presidents going back to George W. Bush on the provision of military aid to Azerbaijan. And one of the outcomes of that, and it took a long time, way too long, it took a war that emptied Artsakh of its Armenian people, right? It took that war. But the Biden administration has not waived Section 907, the restriction on aid to Azerbaijan, for the last 2 years, right? So that is better than not. We're not satisfied because it's a unilateral action taken by the administration that they can reverse on a moment's notice. We need to see that written into law, established as a statute. But that's an example of how you can make a difference. It's never going to be what we want, and it's not in the realm of hard power, but it's the type of deliverable that you can get through good advocacy. Another way to think about soft power is some of it is what happens, and some of it is what doesn't happen. So, for example, military aid not going to Azerbaijan, and all the other consequences that might befall Armenia for any range of decisions it might have made over the years, whether it was sending deminers to Syria or its relations with Russia over the years or whatever. Armenia has, I think, not taken some of the hits that other countries would have taken had there not been a strong diaspora, having Armenia's back. I'll give an example. It's a recent example, and you guys can all determine for yourselves if it's an apt analogy or an apt comparison. We saw just this week that Georgia passed some laws that dealt with foreign agent registration. I actually think their laws are not that different than U.S. laws on that subject, but I'm sure others will know more about the details of that legislation. But and they, as a result of that and other things, got sanctioned by the U.S. government. Right? Azerbaijan committed a genocide against the people of Artsakh, occupies Armenian land, holds Armenian hostages. No sanctions. Right? So they have the shield, let's say, of geopolitics, of oil, or whatever it is that they have. Georgia had the goodwill of the U.S. government as long as they, towed a certain line. But once they stepped outside of that lane, got sanctioned. I don't think Armenia would be treated the same way, frankly, as either Azerbaijan because of the geopolitics or Georgia because of how they just got treated. So that being said, let me add that while we should always seek to be part of the dialogue in Washington on Armenian issues, we should not fetishize the idea that a seat at the table is an end in itself, that the photo opportunity with a policymaker is remotely connected to influence with that policymaker. Sometimes the photo is a substitute for progress, not a symbol of progress. We need to guard against that. We have to understand that the discourse is important, intellectual discourse is important, the moral appeals are essential, but I think there's still, based on 1,000 years living under, or thousands of years living under the Persians or the Parthians or the Russians, the Ottomans or whoever, that there's this notion that there's some clever way that we can shortcut the process and kind of just trick our way into influence through some inside connection. Have not seen that work. There's very little evidence for that, but I think there's still this notion that if somebody knows somebody, they can get this done and there's a quick fix. That's not how things work, I think, in Washington. There are from time to time little problems that can be solved, right, with like a clever fix, but changing policy over time is usually the work of movements, and the progress is must be earned. Number 8, is the Armenian diaspora today in a position to influence U.S. policy toward Armenia? How do you manage the risk that diaspora's goals sometimes differ from what is actually happening in Armenia? Well, we would start from the premise. We start, in fact, from the premise that we're Americans. I mentioned, my dad's service in the military. Thousands upon thousands of Armenians have served our armed forces, but also contributed in every conceivable way to American society. I grew up in the Armenian Youth Federation, and during World War II, they actually bought bonds to buy a bomber to fight Nazi Germany. And there's like 1,000 stories like that, 1,000 stories, even of young men who left for the war but never returned. So that's who we are. We're Americans. Our heritage is Armenian. Some of our allies are not Armenian at all, but they feel a connection to Armenia. And we enter the fray. We're stakeholders in the American political landscape wearing that hat, right? It's not to do the bidding of anybody. And as much as I love America and I respect this wonderful, great nation that has welcomed my family here now 100 years ago, the idea that this or that policymaker, in the U.S. establishment holds a particular view doesn't oblige us to hold that view, right? We're citizens. We're not slaves. We're not told what to do by our government. We are stakeholders and entitled every bit as much as the highest diplomat to our say about how America should engage with the world. So that's who we are. We don't answer to our American government. We don't answer to the Armenian government. Certainly not anyone else. We are who we are. We're Armenian Americans, and that's our voice. This brings me to that people often think that, well, the diasporans need to, let's say, work for Yerevan or align with Yerevan, or let's say at the outside, not challenge Yerevan. Really doesn't make sense. Like legally, it doesn't make sense. Politically, it would be unwise. And then think about this, right? If we spoke with the voice of diplomacy, right, we would not be bringing any additionality to the equation. Our job is to create opportunities, to expand the range of options available to our nation, right? To put our opponents on their back foot and to place Armenia in a more advantageous position. Those are our aspirations as Americans. And if we conducted that effort, if we worked toward those aims, those ends, in the voice of diplomacy, we would not be effective. We would not bring additionality to the Armenian world. In the same sense, if Armenian diplomats spoke in our voice, they would not be effective, right? So there needs to be different voices, but they should be ultimately aligned toward similar, like a common North Star, which is Armenia's survival. That, I think, has existed at many times during our most recent experience with Armenian independence. I'm not sure that we're seeing that as much today, and I think that's very unfortunate. I think, to be kind, I think sometimes folks in Yerevan, I'll speak to the Prime Minister, views the value that diasporans can bring to Armenia, the advantages that diasporans can secure for Armenia on the global stage. I think sometimes he views that through a domestic political lens, and then is willing to, for those domestic political reasons, forego advantages that should be available to Armenia. And that's, I think, ultimately unwise. I think a more global view is to look out as Armenians to our brothers and sisters and say, how is it that we can each do something to contribute to Armenia's survival, its sustainability, its viability, and maybe not to rise above parochialism, to rise above pettiness. So that's that. Number 9. Okay. I'll distill this question. Do you think that the traditional Armenian approaches, do you think that traditional approaches in supporting Armenian arts taken by diaspora organizations are relevant today? That's a really good question. I think everyone in the Armenian world, homeland, diaspora, anyone else, understands. I think anyone serious understands that we live in a rapidly changing world that requires us to, be adept, agile, able to adapt and reinvent our approaches for new times. That I think is absolutely essential. So we invest incredibly heavily in bringing young people. We housed over 100 young people just this year to come to Washington. We've just had another 3 days of advocacy here in Washington, where hundreds more came to meet with our legislators. A great number of them very young, let's say 18 to 25. We understand that we need to always bring new blood into our system, and that they, just by virtue of their devotion, will look at what's being done, respect that which is helpful, and reinvent or replace that which needs to be renewed. And that, I think, that churn is very, very important. And as you judge institutions, there are many great institutions in our world. One of the signatures of a great Armenian institution is, do they invest in youth? Do they involve youth? Do they integrate youth into the core of their activities, or is it a sideline, like an add-on? So very, very important. So as much as things change, and I touched on this before, so things have to change. But one thing that won't change, and I stated this before, I'll repeat it now, is that service and sacrifice will be constants in Armenia, right? I cannot conceive of a situation in which service and sacrifice will not be requirements of Armenia's survival. Now, there is an approach. There is a view counter to that. And I'm not going to articulate it as fairly as I should, but there are others who can. And they hold a view that Armenia can transact its way to a stable peace, a stable equilibrium with its neighbors, and that might involve concessions of land or sovereignty or security or corridors or some set of equity, some set of concessions can be made, and that those good faith concessions would be reciprocated with other good faith concessions, and Armenia and its neighbors to the east and west would then coexist in some stable equilibrium, at least for some period, and that is the path forward. The view contrary to that, a view that I'm more sympathetic to, is that the threats against Armenia are existential. It's not convenient. It's not fun. No one likes to talk about Armenia being under siege for the foreseeable future. The prospect that our children and great grandchildren and farther down the line are going to deal with hostile neighbors who, frankly, have existential aims to eliminate us from that part of the world. That's not going to win a popularity contest, but I think it's the truth, right? And we owe it to ourselves to speak to that truth. So this is, I think, a really important tension in the Armenian world, and I would say that we should not be so hungry for change, as if that's just undefined change, that all that that we've learned from, let's say, the last 1,000 years, maybe more, right? We'll throw out the window and just put all our faith in the fact that the world will be a better place and treat us more kindly. I mean, how can any reading of our history support that? If it's maybe a popular view, but I think it's a bit like just giving your kids cupcakes. It's like they'll love it, but it's not good for them. And in the long run, you'd do better to feed them Brussels sprouts or broccoli. So next question. Okay. Is the diaspora's political influence declining? Right, you see the question there. Is it declining? Do you agree with this assessment? I'll give a very quick answer. I happen to be, I work here at the ANCA I joined the Armenian Revolutionary Federation as a young man. It's been a very, very important part of my life. And one of the things I've enjoyed reading, and now I'm like 58 years old now, so this has been close to 40 years, is one of my favorite literary forms is the obituary of the ARF, that this particular nationalist model is a dinosaur and it's destined for the junk heap of history. And there's very much of that. I see that quite a bit. It's hasn't borne out yet. We've been around 130 years. You know what? I make no predictions for the future, but if I'm around in 25 years, let's do another AMA. I will talk to you about. And if I'm wrong, people can tell me I'm wrong. I think that the approach we have and the influence that we've generated have been valuable to our nation and are respected as such. And I think we have a very important place in the Armenian political landscape. So the question is, how can we ensure our relevance? And the answer is by working hard, standing on our work, and letting other people judge for themselves. It's not what we say about ourselves that matters. It's what the Armenian world has to say about us. Okay, number 11. How does the ANC plan to address this contradiction? The contradiction between U.S. support for Armenia and its military relationship with Azerbaijan. Okay, that's a question. And I will thank you, Christine, for that question. I will draw a very sharp line here. A very clear litmus test. Folks, including here in Washington, who claim friendship with Armenia, but will not hold Azerbaijan accountable, will not deter renewed Azerbaijani aggression against Armenians, are not friends, period. And we should call them out as such. I cannot imagine a circumstance in which somebody could say they're friendly to Armenia, toss a couple of dollars toward Armenia, send flowers to the funeral of the people and homeland of Artsakh, but yet do nothing to hold Azerbaijan to account and then say they're our friends. That is the very definition of a cheap date. That is the very definition of a cheap date. We've been in this country, as I said, for 130, our organization's been here 130 years, our community's been here much longer than that. Armenians first arrived actually 500 years ago, but in large numbers over the last 150 years in this country. We've contributed in every aspect of American political life, and the idea that someone can then say, we're a friend of Armenia, we won't put a leash on Turkey, we will not put a leash on Azerbaijan, but we're your friend, guess what? They're not our friend, and we have to have the courage to call them out. We're not obliged to look down at our feet and mumble something when people lie to us in that fashion. We owe it to ourselves, our ancestors, our future, our homeland, to call out those types of lies. So we are not, and will never allow ourselves to be a cheap date. We will not let photo opportunities or a seat at the table substitute for the actual accountability that we deserve, that America should, just as a matter of principle, deliver. Number 12. Long question here. Some believe that the U.S. sees a unified Turkey-Azerbaijan alliance as necessary to counter Russia and Iran. Okay, good question. What is your honest view of this perspective? I think my default setting is honest, so I'll just answer it honestly as I have, I think, prior to this question. But I'm a little cynical on this. I've been in a couple of rodeos on this subject. I will say that the folks who run U.S. policy, not the American people, certainly not a lot of our friends in Congress, but those who've risen, in their 50s and 60s to some high reach of U.S. diplomacy or defense or intelligence, they will advance their Russia and Turkey and other regional policies down to the last Armenian, down to the final measure of Armenian soil and sovereignty. And they will do so without losing a moment's sleep. It will do so without losing a moment's sleep. That reality must be understood. It must become part of our political culture. That the idea that, somebody high up says something nice, pats the Armenians on the head, and therefore deserves our support, sets an extremely low bar. An extremely low bar. Policymakers are treating Armenia, as I said, as a derivative. It's a derivative of other larger policy sets, and maybe that's impossible to change. Maybe it's avoidable. We can work in that space, but we certainly shouldn't cheerlead it. Certainly shouldn't endorse it. So very clearly, there's a very cynical view of Armenians in the city. How might we advance? How might we be manipulated to advance some other set of regional priorities? That's not good enough. That's not good enough. Number 14. Now that genocide is recognized, basically, do you need to redefine the Armenian cause? I actually don't accept the premise of that question, and I'll take a drink and then tell you why. Okay. Our North Star, Husayn Asta, has always been the survival of the Armenian nation, the preservation of Armenia at the table of nations. Right. That is our North Star goal. Dealing with the genocide, right, addressing it, its recognition, reparations, ultimately Turkey coming to terms, reckoning with its own responsibilities. These are pursued, have been and are pursued because they align with the larger long-term goal of Armenia's survival. The same can be said of Artsakh, the same can be said of a stronger Armenia, the same can be said of US-Armenia relations. We pursue policies that support that aim. It's a mistake, I think. I think it's simply a misread to say that ANCA, for example, only cares about this particular tactic at the expense of all other things. I am a little. I actually think that most Armenians understand that Armenians are devoted, the ANC certainly, that all of us are devoted to Armenia's future. But yet, there's like this narrative that has been fed to our world, has been injected into the Armenian veins that try to create like these false choices among Armenians. That like there are, the visionary Armenians who see Armenia's future and who strive for something better for the Armenian nation, and there are those who are hung up on the past. It's kind of an American idea, very forward-looking people that doesn't need to worry too much about the past. Not going to really spend much time talking about slavery or the Native Americans or the internment of Japanese Americans. Like very forward-looking. Armenia doesn't have that luxury. The crimes of the past continue to impose terrible costs upon the Armenians today, whether that's in terms of resources or borders or population. The past lives with us. I think it was William Faulkner who said the past is not past. I think the past is not dead. It's not even past, I think was Faulkner's exact quote. So we align all of our efforts with the long-term goal of Armenia's survival. Other false choices are you either care about the homeland or the diaspora, you either care about Artsakh or Armenia. This is like, if you want to understand how foolish this is, imagine talking to parents about why they should set one of their children against the other. It's only an enemy would do that. And I think we should have the courage to call that out when people do that. And final note on there, there is a lot of chatter about how Armenians don't get along. I think another question down the road touches on this. I would say Armenian disunity has become like a meme in the Armenian world. The fact of the matter is, and I deal with dozens of ethnic groups here in Washington, we have less disunity, more cohesiveness, more cooperation, more collaboration than any other ethnic group in the city. I'd be glad to do an hour documenting that exact point. Next, number 15. Armenian lobbying was once among the top 3 most influential. Like, why are you slipping is basically the question. And why don't you hire lobbyists? Our approach, and folks can agree or disagree, is to speak in an Armenian American voice. Ultimately, an American voice, right? It's an American voice. We happen to be of Armenian heritage, but we're speaking as citizens, as local voters, as local constituents. I took part in dozens of meetings yesterday. Our ANC activists held hundreds of meetings across the US Congress, and they were meetings where a local representative talked to the local member of Congress about local issues, about what's going on at the local church. Will you come to the food festival? We want to have a town hall with you on this subject. And that is our voice. We're not renting a politician. We're not buying a PAC. We are growing our support from the bottom up, actual citizens talking to their legislators. Turkey and Azerbaijan don't have that. They try to astroturf it. They try to foster this false impression of it, but they don't have it. They aspire toward it. We have it. Talk on lobbyists. Lobbyists typically are good at getting their clients a piece of the pie in Washington, a regulation, a appropriation, a tax break of some sort, usually like something small that just needs like a fix, but rarely a change in policy. That's not what lobbyists are hired for. They're not changed to disrupt things. They're changed to take advantage of a very narrow range of action. Movements are not run by lobbyists. Fundamental change doesn't come across by lobbyists. Look at anything that's happened in America, especially in the foreign policy space. Look at the Genocide Convention, right? And the US adoption of the Genocide Convention. Look at the apartheid movement. Look at what happened on Darfur. Look at, more as a domestic issue, civil rights. These were not lobbyist-led initiatives, right? As much as wealthy Armenians think that there's a fix, that a lobbyist will fix the Armenian question, I think it requires more attention than that. I think there may be a role for lobbyists, but the bulk of the work is going to fall on our shoulders. And I think that to not recognize that is to absolve ourselves of responsibility that the responsibility each of us bear. Yes. Some have, number 16, my favorite question. Some people have expressed concern about ANCA's affiliations with certain external powers, particularly with Russia. How do you address these concerns and clarify the organization's approach to maintaining its values and independence? That comes from Reddit, which is the most interesting space, Armenian space on the internet. I would say that on any given day, literally any given day, we'll be accused of being a tool of one or another major power. We are frequently criticized as fully owned subsidiaries of the Democratic or Republican parties. First, let me say, for those who study rhetoric, this is a logical fallacy, classic logical fallacy. It's called an ad hominem attack, which means against the person. If there are critiques of policy or procedures or practices, they should be leveled at the level of merit, right? Are there things that we've done that are bad or wrong or counterproductive or destructive, right? That's a very fair way to engage. But to just say, you should not be listened to because you are affiliated with A, B, or C, it's a logical fallacy, and I think it's a lazy way to argue. But more fundamentally, I'll say it this way because I only have a few minutes left. I will say to all these criticisms, the domestic and foreign, the fact is that we do take sides, and we're very clear about the side that we take. We take the Armenian side. Somebody in this world, somebody in this country needs to take the Armenian side. There'll be plenty of people to fight the battles for these great powers. They're very large powers. They have nuclear weapons. They have billions and trillions of dollars in resources, right? They'll do fine. The Democratic Republican parties will do fine. They have tons of money, a lot of support. One way or another, they'll do just fine. That's not certain when it comes to Armenians, right? Our kids, our people wake up in the morning wondering whether or not Armenia will last the week, right? That is very different than almost any country on the planet. It's certainly different than these major powers, certainly different than the political forces that shape the American political landscape, right? Somebody's got to be the one, and we are proud to help contribute to that, that says, Armenia is going to be our North Star. Let's see there. I guess final thought on criticism is, I think Winston Churchill said, don't stop for every barking dog. I think that's generally a good rule. Antoine writes a long question about Armenian disunity and France and Francophony, and I'm going to try and move through that question as quickly as I can. I'll repeat what I said earlier, that Armenians are actually more cohesive, more highly networked, and less divided than any of the dozens of ethnic groups I work with in Washington. And more precisely, again, this is like a fetish. It's a meme. It's hard to uproot. But divisions that you see in the Armenian world, I think if you examine them, right, maybe look a couple layers down, I think very often they're personal or parochial. Maybe they're turf war issues, or some question of which prerogative, which organization or individual, what they're entitled to. But it's typically not about fundamental aims. Certainly not about the fundamental hopes and dreams for our homeland. That is true with a lot of other ethnic groups. I think I think it was Freud who called it the narcissism of small differences. How groups that are actually agree the most tend to be the most divisive on the least important issues. I think we might fall in that category. I'm not a psychologist, but I'll throw that out there. Second to last question here. Why in 80 years of operation has the office not prioritized the hereditary rights of the Armenian people? Additionally, why have issues of patriotism and compensation not been central to the office's activities? Actually, I'm going to say, well, first of all, we've been around more than 80 years. We've been around about 130 years under different banners here in Washington and New York and Boston, later in California. Actually, I think we've led the struggle for Armenian rights in pretty much every arena, whether it's Western Armenia or Artsakh and the East. I feel like I'm sure there are others who wave the flag of Armenian patriotism, and we love and respect them. But I think we're right up at the front of the parade on that one. And as we've been called many things, unpatriotic, I don't think is one of them. Last question. Is a great question. You have received a call from Aram Hamparian from 2041. What would you ask him? I would only ask, what should we have done better? What should we have done differently? How might we have served and sacrificed in a more effective way to hand off our Armenian world to our kids and grandkids in a better vijag, a better situation than what we inherited? That's pretty much a lot. Like what wisdom, what knowledge, what insights could an older Hamparian, share with a younger Hamparian? Although I'm not very young, but yeah, if I had that opportunity, I just have a long list of questions of, how could we have done better? How could we have done better? Each of us have a bardaganatun. We have a responsibility, and that stretches backward, right, to the far reaches of our history, but it also stretches forward to generations that we won't see. We're, figuratively planting trees today whose shade we will not sit under. So I think that would be my approach. I think, friends, I think I'm coming in under 1 hour, which I strive mightily to do. But I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. I think Armagora is a great new platform. It's one that I want to see a lot of Armenians join, to have debate and discourse. It's actually a good thing. And you know what? In a sense, it's a political thing. I mean, you think about the Greek roots of the word political. It's like the efforts of many, right, to kind of work together. That's actually a good thing. And this can be like Armagora has Greek roots as well. It can be that place where we come together and have discussions, and that's a good thing. And if we disagree, that's normal. And if we can find areas of common ground and consensus, even better. But we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there without discussion and discourse and debate and airing out of differences. That's a very healthy thing. We need much more of it. We should not be afraid from it. We should run to the debate, not from the debate. So thank you very much, Armagora.